Well, it's great to be here. It's great to be part of this conference. As Paul said, this is going to be sort of stepping back a little bit from the specific themes related to financial markets. And what I want you to think about is broadly new technologies in media markets and to what extent technological change makes media markets function better and do a better job at the things that we hope they're doing from a social perspective, including providing people with information, consumers, investors. If we think from the broad historical sweep of, say, the last 100 years, there have been an incredible magnitude of innovations in the technology for delivering people information. So we think with radio, with television, with cable television, with the internet, and most recently with social media. From a very simple kind of economist's perspective, you would say the cost of collecting, aggregating, distributing, consuming information has gone down dramatically, exponentially over that time period. And a very simple hypothesis you might have as a result is that the extent to which people are informed, the quality of people's information, the accuracy of their beliefs, the efficiency of the functioning of markets has increased exponentially at the same time. Casual look out at the world would suggest it's not so obvious that's happened. It's not clear. There's not a lot of good evidence that would suggest people in 2019 have much more accurate beliefs about the world or much more informed and kind of rational about things than people 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago. And what you see in each of these historical episodes, going all the way back to radio and before, is whenever there is that kind of technological change, we see two things happening. One is enthusiasm and excitement about the potential improvements and benefits that this technology can bring to information, to consumers, to investors, and at the same time, concerns about unintended consequences and potential downsides of those technologies. And over time, we see a kind of seesaw back and forth, and the overall effect that we observe over long periods of time is a combination of, yes, these things are making markets more efficient, but they also interact in other ways with biases of consumers, with inefficiencies in markets, and have potential downside consequences as well. So I want to talk today about some very recent work that I've been doing with Hunt Alcott, who's here at NYU, here in New York at NYU, and Luca Bragieri and Sarah Eichmeyer, who are PhD students at Stanford, which is trying to get some handle on this set of questions for the most recent of these dramatic technological changes that we've seen in media markets, which is the introduction of social media. So it's a little bit hard to remember right now, but not so very long ago, like a couple years ago, most of the discussion of social media was about the benefits that it was potentially bringing to society, the good things that it was potentially doing. This is like a graphic from Facebook marketing materials about the fact that what would we think that a social network like Facebook might do? It connects people, it makes it easier for them to communicate, it provides a new source for information to flow around the world, and there's a lot of reasons that Facebook and lots of others pointed to suggest, wow, that's going to make the world a much better place. Obviously, that conversation has shifted a lot in the last couple of years. And now, kind of at the other end of this pendulum, where a lot of the discussion about social media is focusing on the potential downsides and negatives. And you could sort of organize those into two parts. First, there's a conversation about how is this technology affecting the individuals who use it? To what extent is having this available actually just making people better off? Or is it actually making people worse off due to things like the technology being addictive, leading people to use it in ways that are not great for them, leading them to use it maybe more than they should? And there's a whole conversation around mental health impacts of these technologies that might go along with that, particularly focused on younger people, where the time that people are spending using smartphones, using social media, many people have pointed to correlational suggestive evidence that might indicate negative effects. Then, at a broader level, as I said, one of the main reasons we care about media markets is not just the impact on individual utility, but the broader social consequences that they have, particularly through their role in providing information to people. And so there's been a big discussion, obviously, about the kind of information that people are getting from social media. Is it accurate? Is it not accurate? Is it false? Is it true? And to what extent that's contributing to things like political polarization in society. So these are big conversations right now. We are far from the only people thinking about these questions. What I would say is that most of the existing evidence that you see cited in discussions of these questions are of a descriptive correlational kind of form. So for example, a lot of the evidence on the mental health impacts of something like social media use is roughly of the form, we surveyed a lot of people and we asked them how much they use social media, and we also measured their mental health, and it turns out people that use Facebook 7 hours a day are not very happy. Now, is that good evidence for the proposition that Facebook is causing them to be unhappy? Not so clear. Might be the reason they're on Facebook 7 hours a day is because something's not so great in their lives. And so broadly speaking, inferring causal impacts of something like social media from that kind of correlation of evidence is difficult. That evidence is valuable. It points us in the direction of important hypotheses. But it isn't definitive in pinning down causal effects. So what we wanted to do in this project was to say, could we devise a kind of gold standard RCT, randomized controlled trial type experiment like you might use to evaluate the impact of, say, a new medication, to adapt it to this context to look at the causal effects of Facebook. And so what we did was we set up an experiment in which we, just quite recently, this just concluded a few months ago, in the 4 weeks in the run-up to the 2018 midterm elections, we paid a treatment group of people basically to deactivate their Facebook accounts for a month. And so we could use that randomized variation to try to get at the impacts. And then we tried, given that we were doing this, sort of set up this big thing to pay people a bunch of money to turn off their Facebook accounts, we then wanted to measure everything we possibly could, as many of these different outcomes as possible. So on the individual utility side, we're going to try to measure standard sorts of measures of subjective well-being and happiness to get at some of these mental health effects, measures of people's social interactions, and also measures of how does their use of Facebook change following the experiment. So if you had in mind something like, maybe these technologies are addictive, maybe people are using them too much, then a natural consequence of those kinds of models is if you get people off it for a month, they might change their usage in the future. They might say use it less because they, just like if you send somebody to rehab and get them off of heroin for a while, you hope maybe they would use it a bit less in the future. On the broader impact side, we were going to measure effects on news knowledge. So to what extent are people actually learning real information from Facebook, impacts on voting, and impacts on measures of political polarization. And then something that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on here, but that is an important part of this study too, is we have kind of incentivized, valid measures of how much are people willing, how much do we have to pay people in order to deactivate their Facebook account for a month? Like, what is the real price to you at which we need to pay you at least this much to get you to do that? Think about it as sort of a measure of, at least from people's own perception, the value that Facebook is delivering to them. And we have those measures both at the beginning and also after this experience that people have turning off their Facebook account. So another measure of the sort of addiction question here is, do those valuations fall? So does the experience of being off Facebook for a month cause you to value Facebook less in the future? And so we can kind of translate those via an economic model that I won't talk about here into measures of welfare and consumer surplus that is being generated by Facebook. Okay, so I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly and leave some time for questions. Let me just give you the kind of quick preview. So the impacts we see, you want to think about, I'll tell you more details, but these are the impacts on the people we randomized to deactivate their Facebook accounts. And these are, because our budget for this was finite, that is restricted to the population of people whose price for doing that is $100 or less. So we're only able to offer people up to about $102 to deactivate their account. So anybody who said, well, for me, you'd need to pay me $1,000, they're sort of out of the experiment. So that's relevant because these are all effects local to that population of people who have valuations up to $102, which accounts for about 60% or so of all Facebook users. So on the individual utility side, what do we see? We see broad evidence consistent with small to moderate sized effects in the direction that people have been worried about. So people who deactivate their Facebook accounts are happier by a bunch of different measures. Their mental health kind of measures do improve, not dramatically, but to some meaningful amount. They also indeed quite clearly, and here almost, I would say, dramatically, reduce their demand for Facebook following the experiment. Once they're out of our experiment, if they were in the treatment group where they deactivated their accounts, they're using Facebook quite a bit less in the future, and also express a desire in free response interviews and so on to reduce and change the way they're using Facebook. On these broader impacts, we see a kind of two-sided coin here, which I think is interesting and intuitive once you think about it, which is we show that Facebook is indeed informing people. So people who are off it know less about what's happening. They know fewer facts. They're not able to answer kind of news quiz type questions as well. So there is real information they're getting. And as well, they are less politically polarized. Say their beliefs on issues that were salient in that period of time around the midterms, things like the Kavanaugh hearings, are less extreme and less far out in the direction of their own party. And those two things go together in a natural way. Basically, what does it say? It says if people are on Facebook, they know less about what's going on in politics, and they're also therefore less upset about it, plausibly, as an interpretation. So you think about the kind of, what does that mean for society? Well, it's complicated. Would we rather have a democracy where people know less and are less upset and kind of don't hate each other so much because they don't know what's going on? Or would we rather have a democracy where people are really engaged, know a ton, know everything that's happening, and feel really, really strongly about it? We're not going to answer that question, but that I think these results kind of point you toward that as a tough dilemma to solve. And then with these welfare measures, the prices that we have to pay people, we show consistent with the Facebook demand effects that people's valuation, monetary valuation of a month on Facebook is reduced quite substantially by the experience of being in our treatment group. Nevertheless, I would say on welfare, the amount that people are willing to pay for Facebook is big. And so the aggregate consumer surplus that we would calculate that Facebook is generating, these misprediction results suggest it's overestimated by people's kind of naive initial valuations. But even after you account for this misprediction, it's still really big and really positive. So let me kind of walk you through in some detail exactly what we did, because I think exactly what we did is important for interpreting these results and for catching some important nuances and subtleties about what they do and don't tell us. So this is sort of a schematic of the way this experiment proceeded. So we recruited people between end of September, early October of last year. They completed a baseline survey with some information I'll tell you about, and then a midline survey. And it was in that midline survey that we elicited their prices and then randomized them into these two groups. And so as of that midline on October 11th, they were randomized into either a treatment group where they got we paid them $102 to deactivate their account, or a control group where we paid them nothing. And then, so the treatment group deactivated their account from September up to November 8th. That ended just before November 8th, and there was an end-line survey where we measured a bunch of outcomes. And then there's also a post-end-line survey about a month later in early December, where we measured things like how has people's usage changed following the experiment. So that's like a month. We can go follow people out to a month post-experiment to see what happened. Okay. These are the number of people involved in those different stages. So we recruited people for this study on Facebook. So we targeted Facebook ads to people as a way to recruit them into the study. Like anything you're trying to do with Facebook ads, you need to show a lot of them to get many people to click through and respond. So about 1.7 million people saw our ads, 30,000 clicked on them, and then through various sort of stages of our screening questions and signing consent forms and so on, that boiled down to a final sample of about 3,000 people who were randomized in our experiment. So the real sample size relevant to the experiment is about 3,000 people who are going to go and do this. This is what our ads looked like. We tried to capture as close as we could. We didn't do great on this, but as close as we could to a representative sample of Facebook users. It's important that these ads were designed not to telegraph anything about the purpose of the study or what we were trying to study. Something that would not be great is if we said, hey, do you wish you used Facebook less? Come sign up for our experiment, we'll help you do that. Then the validity of these results would be a little bit, they'd still be valid results, but for this population of people then who would be kind of pre-screened to really want to reduce Facebook use. So just to kind of quickly summarize these different surveys, so in the baseline survey, we limit people to people 18 and older. So this is not, we're working on another study. I would love to do a study like this looking at 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, really target that set of questions because they're different and they're very important. We're working on that in some separate work, but that's not this. This is like really adults. Importantly, we limited this to people who used Facebook, who said they use Facebook at least 15 minutes per day. So we're not really interested in what is the impact of deactivating your Facebook account on people who never use Facebook in the first place. Consent form, basic demographics, and then all of the outcome measures that we're eventually going to look at, we measure in this baseline to have baseline. What are your political views? What is your news knowledge? And how happy are you? And so on at baseline, so we can compare that to the changes over the experiment. To measure subjective well-being, happiness, we're going to use some survey questions that are standard in the literature. And then because this was an outcome we really cared about, we also use a second approach, which is less often used in the literature, but has been used before, which is instead of asking you retrospectively something like, hey, you know, thinking back over the last month, how happy would you say you were? We're going to do that. But we're also going to send you, if you're in the study, text messages at kind of random times during the day that say, how happy do you feel right now? And you say 1 to 10. So like in this moment, how happy do you feel? And previous research has shown that measures a different aspect of well-being, and in some sense measures, if that's the aspect you're going for, it measures it more precisely. So we'll ask that about happiness, about loneliness, and then this kind of question of these different things, what would you say best describes how you're feeling right now? So then the midline survey is where we elicit these prices. We use something called the Becker-de-Groot-Marchak procedure, which is a standard procedure in the literature to get in an incentivized way to make it incentive compatible for people to tell you their correct price. We're going to measure those both for what would your price be to deactivate Facebook this month, and then what would be your price if we wanted you to deactivate Facebook the following month. And we ask that so we can compare to then post-treatment, how does that price for that second month change? And importantly, something that ends up, I think being quite important here is we're going to require everybody, including everybody in the control group, to deactivate their Facebook account for 24 hours following the midline survey. So the control group deactivates for 24 hours, the treatment group deactivates for a month. Why do we do it that way? We do it because that's going to make the treatment and control group more comparable, and also a lot of people who might leave the study because they say, I don't want to deactivate my Facebook account. We want to get them out of the way before we do this randomization. If we had randomized people into the treatment group and then a lot of them left, but more of the control group stayed, that kind of differential attrition is a big problem for the validity of the estimates. And so as I'll show you, we ended up, this is thanks to the amazing work of my co-authors, having remarkably little attrition from this experiment. So we do this randomization, as I told you. We give, this is just like the screen that we show people for that 24-hour deactivation. It turns out, importantly, it is quite easy to temporarily deactivate your Facebook account. You can go in and do that. And then if you come back later, you can turn it back on and all your content and all your friends and everything is still there. So it would have been much more costly for people if we wanted them to shut down their Facebook account, and then when they turn it back on, they have to start sending friend requests to like everybody they know again and so on. So it's not like that. They can still use Facebook Messenger. In the N-line survey, we re-ask all of these outcome measures that you'll see more about, and then we ask again, what is your willingness to accept? W2A here I'm going to use to indicate that price. Like how much would we have to pay you? What is your willingness to accept money to deactivate your Facebook account? So we re-elicit that for that last month. And then in that post-N-line survey, a month later, we're going to look at A, did people reactivate their accounts? How did they vote in the midterm elections? What kind of political donations did they give? Some of these we're still working on because those data after the midterm are released slowly. We have a survey where we measure usage afterwards, and for iPhone users, we can do that directly from the screen time application in the OS, so we can get people to go, like, take out your phone, look at it, and tell us how many minutes did you use the Facebook app in the last week. And then we send people some emails with invitations to things like, hey, would you like to click on some links to go look at tools to help you reduce your smartphone use? Think of that as another outcome for, or does this experiment leave people kind of wishing they were using less? So how do we, important issue here is how do we verify compliance with this? We're paying you $100 to deactivate your Facebook account. How do we know that you did? So another nice feature of the setup of this platform is that's very easy to validate because everybody, no matter what your privacy settings, you have a public Facebook URL that if you have an active account always returns something. Depending on your privacy settings, it might just return your name or your name and your picture or various things. But it always returns something if your account is alive. That's Mark Zuckerberg's profile. If your account is deactivated, it returns an error message. So we can just, throughout the study, keep pinging these URLs to determine whose account is active and who's not and make sure that people are complying. We paid people various things in addition to the deactivation payment for completing the different surveys. Okay, so quick summary statistics, kind of summarize what we did. The sample is not totally representative, despite our best efforts, of Facebook users. It's pretty representative on income and gender and race. It oversamples young people, oversamples college-educated people, oversamples Democrats relative to Republicans. So that's the best we could do. This sort of shows you the attrition rates. So of the people who started the experiment, 99% of them finished the end line. That's like a very, very low attrition rate. And that attrition is balanced in treatment and control. So there's no different pattern of attrition in the treatment and control groups. And that's true for various of these other things. In contrast, the share of days that they're supposed to be deactivated that they are deactivated is very different as we would hope it would be. You can see this is compliance with the text messages. So about 90% or so of the text messages are returned. People answer those questions. And that's not different between treatment and control. And this is the compliance with deactivation. So this sort of gray shaded area, which you can barely see, is the 24-hour deactivation period. Gray is what share of control users are deactivated. Red is what share of treatment users are deactivated. So as we would like, both of them are deactivated at high rates in those 24-hour periods, whereas in the month in between, the treatment group is almost all deactivated at about 90%, and almost all of the control group has active accounts. The 10% of non-compliers in this experiment, so of the people who were supposed to deactivate their accounts consistently, it's about 90% of the accounts are inactive. And that other 10% we can dig in and look at, and is really a subset of people who just didn't comply at all. So it's not like different people are coming in and out, on different days. There's a subset of users who are just about 10% who just decided not to do this, basically. We could follow up surveys with them, and they confirm that. And so we're going to adjust for that in all the estimation that we do. So I'm now going to kind of flip through outcomes, first showing you outcomes at baseline, a few outcomes at baseline, and then showing you the treatment effects, the impact of the deactivation on a bunch of different outcomes. This is the distribution. So if you ever wondered what is Facebook worth to people, or if Facebook wanted to charge a subscription fee, what subscription fee could they charge, loosely speaking? This is the distribution of those values in our experiment. So the median is right at $100. There's a big bunching at $100. So about half of people give numbers below $100, half of people give numbers above $100, and there's a lot of spread. You know, we've kind of capped this, but there are people who say, you know, $1 million. And then a lot of mass of people between 0 and 100. So a lot of people saying things like 40, 50, 60. These are people's baseline opinions about Facebook. So we asked people questions like, overall, would you say Facebook improves or worsens people's social lives? Would you say it's good or bad for you personally? Would you say it's good or bad for society? Would you say it makes people more or less happy? Strikingly to us, in contrast to the tenor of much of the public discussion, in this sample of people, all of those responses are clustered pretty closely around 0 in terms of their averages with dispersion. So this is not a sample of, we did not select a sample of people here who are kind of Facebook haters. And it's striking that overall this is a pretty balanced, people have pretty balanced views of on net, is this good or bad? Some questions where it's less balanced. People overwhelmingly say they think that Facebook makes people more polarized. Incidentally, every chart I put up here, we're going to scale things so higher numbers are good for Facebook and lower numbers are bad for Facebook. So everything on the right of these plots is sort of whatever is the good answer for Facebook. Everything on the left is the bad one. So people think it makes them more polarized. People think it allows them, at least some people, a majority of people think it allows them to follow the news better. People are right, notice, that's consistent with what we actually find. They think it gives people more exposure to fake news. And overall, we asked people, would you say that if people were to just quit Facebook, they would really miss it or they wouldn't miss it too much? And so there, the results are tilted a little bit toward people saying, yeah, they would not miss Facebook. Okay. So the impact evaluation, so I'm going to go through a bunch of different outcomes. Let me skip the details. Basically, everything that we're going to do here is pre-registered before we saw the outcomes of the data. So we're not allowed to kind of go fishing and try different specifications to try to massage the results. We said exactly what we're going to do, and everything I'm going to show you is just exactly what we said we'd do ahead of time. The outcomes we're going to look at are the following. One, substitution. That is, people were spending an hour a day on average in our sample using Facebook. So as part of this study, everybody got back an hour a day. Question, what did they do with that? That's that first set of results. Second, how did this impact social interactions, the likelihood you were spending time with your family and your friends? How did it in fact impact happiness and subjective well-being? How did it impact news and political outcomes? And then how did it impact this post-experiment demand for Facebook? Okay, so substitution. For each of these, I'm going to try to show you exactly the questions we asked because that's important to interpreting these things. So what did we ask? We measured how many minutes people said they spent on Facebook. We measured then for a bunch of different time uses, we said, over the last 4 weeks, relative to what is typical for you, would you say that you spent more or less time doing that thing? And so that's going to be our measure of how people substituted their time. As I said, in the control group, the average use of Facebook is 60 minutes per day. Okay. So here is the pattern of substitution. So all the outcome plots I'm going to show you are going to look like this. So what are these plots? This x-axis is the treatment effect of quitting Facebook on something, measured in units of standard deviations of that outcome. So these things are all kind of normalized to be on the same scale. And this is the point estimate. These are 95% confidence intervals. So this says quitting Facebook had a significant effect on the number of minutes you used Facebook. It's not super surprising. but it's like a good validation check that things are working here. And that's about 1.5 standard deviations of the Facebook use distribution. This is then where people substituted and spent their time. And what we see, which I actually think is quite an important result that we did not know going into this, here's something you might have expected to see. When people quit Facebook, they switched to using other social media and or other digital platforms more. We might suppose you thought if people weren't on Facebook, they would all be reading the New York Times and getting like really great information. Maybe. These results suggest that is not true. In fact, all other digital activities go down, not up. So people get back more than 60 minutes. They get back the 60 minutes that they had from Facebook, plus they use Twitter less and they use other stuff on their phone less. I think a simple way to think about this is just when people are off Facebook, they're not picking up their phones as much. And that causes them to use everything less. And that extra time is distributed pretty uniformly across all other offline activities, including watching TV, spending time alone doing something else like reading a book, spending time with your friends and family. And then another thing, for all of these outcome families, I'm going to show you an index that combines all of them together to look at an average effect. We do that in the experimental design to avoid problems of multiple hypothesis testing, where if we have 150 outcomes, some are going to be significant just by chance. And so the main kind of headline results all come from these indices. The index is not so interesting for this, but I'll show you it for other things. OK, so social interactions we measured first in more detail, tried to get at what actual face-to-face interactions have people had. We asked them to list names of people they'd met in person. We asked them about a range of offline activities. And then we also asked them some questions about, did you interact with people who are different from you? Those turn out not to have very interesting effects. But what do we see? We see that quitting Facebook indeed leads people to spend more time doing all of those offline things. It has a positive effect on this measure of friends met in person, which is not significant. And so that overall index of social interactions, offline social interactions, is positive, although in this case not significantly different from 0. You can look at which individual components of the offline things move. So the things that have the biggest effects are going out to dinner, getting together with friends, spending time with your parents. It's notable that those are all face-to-face social interactions. And that matters because a lot of the hypotheses people have put forward for why there might be negative effects of social media on things like mental health relate to the fact that it's crowding out real interactions with real people. Okay, so what do we find on subjective well-being? The questions here are all borrowed from the literature. So there are standard survey questions retrospectively over the last 4 weeks. Would you say you were happy, not happy? How satisfied are you with your life? How lonely would you say you were? How often would you say you felt depressed or anxious, bored, and so on? So this is all just trying to replicate what people in prior studies, in these correlational kind of studies, have done. What we see is across the board positive effects on those things, with a significant positive effect of about 1/10 of a standard deviation on the overall index of subjective well-being. So the text message measures are positive but not significant on their own. Across these, the ones that have the biggest effects are life satisfaction, depression, anxiety. Again, we need to be careful about, there's noise in this to be expected given the size of the sample. So these differences we don't want to pay too much attention to, but the overall index is the thing that's most valid as an estimate of what was the treatment effect of this on subjective well-being. The text messages let us look at this over time. You might have imagined a pattern that looks something like withdrawal, where you become really unhappy for the first week or so, but then it gets better. If anything, it's the opposite. To the extent that you can see anything in the text messages, it's most positive in the first week and then kind of settles down. I have some quotes in here. I probably don't have time to go through all of them, but one of the things just in general that was helpful about this study is we did a lot of qualitative interviews with people and also had them give us free response questions. And those provide a lot of texture on what was really going on. And so consistent with that, we see a lot of people talking about how positive things that they experience while being off Facebook relief of not having to deal with news from the election. Also importantly, these free response things make clear there is heterogeneity in these effects. And while on average people are saying they're happier, and a lot of people reflected that, there are also plenty of people describing that actually it was very difficult being off Facebook. And so this is an example of somebody talking about this, somebody who spends a lot of time by herself, is kind of an introvert, is fairly isolated, uses Facebook a lot for social connections, and found the experience of being off Facebook very difficult. So it's quite clear this positive effect masks a lot of heterogeneity. There's like real benefits for some people and real downsides for others. Okay. On the news and politics outcomes, so we have measures of how much people were using news. So again, this is sort of related to substitution. Did people use online news sources more? Did they watch television news more? And then, so for those substitute news sources, we see basically people use Facebook less for news. They use other digital news sources less, not more, consistent with what I already told you about substitution. And then it's basically zeros across the board on other news sources. So there's no evidence that when people are not on Facebook, they use other news more. Right? That's consistent with what I'll show you in a sec, which is they become less informed when they're off Facebook. So here are these news knowledge measures. They say they're following politics less. They say they're spending fewer minutes on news. Their news knowledge as measured by these kind of factual quizzes of what they know is lower, and the overall index of news knowledge is lower. We don't see any significant effects on voting, although consistent with the information results, the fact that people are kind of less engaged in politics, the point estimate is like not quite significant, but points toward people voted less when they were off Facebook. So the people in the treatment group were less likely to vote in the midterm. And then we have a whole array of measures to try to capture polarization and to what extent Facebook is leading people to be more polarized. So there are what are called affective polarization measures in the literature. That is, how do you feel, if you're a Democrat, how do you feel about the Republicans, or how do you feel about Trump? If you're a Republican, how do you feel about the Democrats? How often did you feel angry toward the other party? Did you read things that helped you understand the other party? And then importantly, we have like a bunch of issue questions, including Kavanaugh and Me Too and Black Lives Matter and a bunch of other things, where we can look at how polarized people's views on those issues are, how far they are in the direction of their party's typical view. So here are the results for polarization. The overall index of polarization is a strongly significant and large decrease. So people who had quit Facebook are less polarized. All of the measures go in that direction. There's noise. Issue polarization in particular is significant on its own, which I think that's like a particularly important measure if we think about the political impacts of this. Skip over like a little more detail. This is the individual questions in the issue polarization. So the places, again, there's noise, you have to be careful, but if you want to squint, you could say the places where the polarization is most affected, where there's the biggest reduction in polarization for people off Facebook, is their views on the Mueller investigation, do police display racial bias, free trade, immigration to some extent. Okay, I'll skip over the magnitudes of these things. Finally, demand for Facebook. So we have a bunch of different measures. First, we asked people, after going through this study, how much more or less time do you plan to spend on Facebook compared to before? So people can say, I plan to spend more time than before, I plan to spend less time than before. We have clicks on these emails we sent people. We can look at how quickly people reactivated their accounts. And then finally, we have this measure at post-end line of how much are people actually using the Facebook app on their phone, and how is that different for the treatment and the control group. And here the effects are dramatic. Like all the other plots I showed you, the x-axis was like 0.1, 0.2 standard deviations. And here, this is like 3-4 times as big, these effects. So there are huge effects on what people report as their planned use, their effects on clicking the time limit email, their effects on how quickly people reactivate, and their effects on use of the mobile app, all in the direction of the people who were in the treatment group following the experiment use Facebook substantially less. And so like this, for example, is a reduction of about 20% in minutes. So the people in the treatment group the following month are using Facebook about 20% less in terms of minutes. Here's the speed of reactivation. So remember, everybody does this 24-hour deactivation period at the end of the experiment. So everybody in the treatment and control group are deactivated on this day following the end line. And then you can see the control group reactivates very quickly, whereas the treatment group takes more time to do it. And we've just been tracking this. This is now out to almost 4 or 5 months. But these are kind of converging, but there's still a significant gap where some of the people in the treatment group still have not reactivated their accounts. Not many, most have, but some haven't. OK, so given time, let me stop there. There's some more quotes. We do some text analysis of what people say, which is all very consistent with this reduced demand for Facebook. When you look at people's free response questions, various kinds of NLP type things show the treatment group is significantly different in the direction of saying, I'm going to use Facebook less, I'm going to use it differently. And so everything points toward that. Questions? I'll stop there.
So awesome. I think this is an awesome study.
Stop right there. That's
So in light of some of the self-report measures, especially those on subjective well-being, some of the prior literature has issues with those. I think you do a good job at the front end of not making it clear what your hypothesis is. Part of the problem is, though, is that every one of us who uses social media knows that everybody thinks social media is bad. And so how worried are you that there might be some hypothesis guess going on, especially since the front-end questions that you ask, everybody seemed to sort of guess what the actual results were? Yeah, so what are your thoughts on that? And maybe, so you briefly went over that you did some textual analysis. It might be nice for skeptics of self-report measures to see status updates post-experiment, and just a sort of like tonal natural language processing type measures to say, hey, they said they were happier, and I'm looking at their status updates, and there's a difference between treatment and control, even though they're still using Facebook after. Great. Maybe they are. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know, just an idea.
So on that last thing, I think that would be great to do. We can't do it because we don't have any access to these people's Facebook accounts. So this
unless they're public.
But the share of people whose like status updates are completely public to anybody who has no friendship connection to them is quite small. So we can't do that. This is, incidentally, all of this is done with no Facebook data or no cooperation from Facebook. We can do all of this completely independently. So we don't have access to, there are lots of neat things you could do. Facebook is slightly skittish about privacy these days. So that would be a tough sell right now. But I think to your first question, which is super important, is obviously, it's like choosing a jury for a murder trial, some like famous murder trial that's been in the news. There's no way to get a sample of people who have no preconceptions about Facebook. And the nature of the experimental design is all of the effects we estimate are valid and are not polluted by that, but they're kind of local to that group of people who selected into the experiment. And I think that's an important caveat. And certainly you could imagine that the share of people who, the group of people who come into this are tilted toward people who might be inclined to think that they would like to use Facebook less. We do some work to address that. We can stratify by some end-line questions, like what we ask people, like, did they think we had an agenda? If so, what did they think our agenda was? We show all of the effects are similar for people who thought we had an agenda to hurt Facebook or thought we had an agenda to help Facebook. People were pretty balanced on that. The other thing is about subjective well-being measures. In general, there are lots of issues, like what does it mean, what people say to a survey question, like how happy have you been in the last 4, interpreting those things are tough. As I say, we're trying to follow basically, show you as many different measures as we can from the literature, but this is also a reason why I personally put more weight on the post-experiment demand outcomes, because those are one of the few things in this experiment which are not based primarily on people's self-reports. That's just actual behavior. And so the fact that people's use goes down a lot is very consistent with the idea that those happiness effects are real.
Hey, thank you very much. That was very interesting. 2 questions. One, when you're asking people if how much they would pay for Facebook, it kind of assumes everyone else is on Facebook. I don't know if you were able to assess the question, how much would you pay for not to be at Facebook at all?
Yeah.
Just like there being a prom, some people go because they have to, but I'm sure a lot of them wish there was never a prom whatsoever in the first place.
Yeah, that is a great question, and a caveat we really try to highlight here is when we talk about measuring the surplus people get from Facebook, that is comparing, it's like how well off are you in a world where you are on Facebook and so is everybody else, right, to a world where you are off Facebook but everybody else is still on it. And that is very different from the experiment. What if we just deleted Facebook from the world? All kinds of other things would adjust in that world, and that's not something we can speak to here. That is incidentally in this study we're working on looking at younger populations. That's like a huge issue there, and we don't have any great ideas for really nailing it there either. But if you think about like, would kids be better off if they used their smartphones less? The experiment, what if I'm in high school, all my friends are using their smartphones and I'm not? How does that affect me? Could be very, very different from what if the entire school stopped using smartphones. So these are big and important issues. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Just one more question, and this might be a little bit too abstract, but once upon a time, when I was younger, I was a co-founder of a social network, which became the largest one in Israel. Then we got crushed by Facebook, so it doesn't matter. But we thought we were doing good things to the world, and for tech entrepreneurs, the older I get, the more it becomes complex for what is actually a good technology to innovate, because anything you do, like this example you started with, seems good at the first layer, second layer, but you can't actually think a generation or 2 forward what happens. Even Uber or the stock markets and all these things people have innovated, it's hard to for us, maybe we're not smart enough to see what the actual impact is. So you think you're doing good, but maybe you're actually just doing bad. So how do you, if you thought about this question, how can entrepreneurs get comfort which is the right way to innovate, and when could ask you to create a positive change?
Yeah, I don't have a great simple solution for you. This is an old question, not a new question. And so it's a question that's asked about all new technologies when they come along. If you were a physicist working on atomic energy in the 1930s, like, wow, you're going to grapple with this issue. It is a conversation we have with every new innovation in media markets. So I think one useful touch point for this is that not all of the issues, but a lot of the issues we're talking about with social media are very similar to the issues we talked about with television. People were using television, still are actually, watching television for 3-4 hours a day. Is that making people better off? And I think what you see there, the takeaway from TV is probably not too different on that margin, which is on net, people value television a lot. People really like it. They're willing to pay a lot for it. But also on net, it seems plausible probably they're using a bit too much, and that 4th hour is not so good for them. So this is an old question and a common pattern. How do you as an innovator, how do we as a society manage innovation to try to get the good innovations and not the bad innovations? I think is difficult, and I think it is particularly hard and even dangerous to try to do that prospectively and to say, okay, we're going to study this aspect of physics, but we're not going to study that aspect of physics because this aspect of physics has potential bad consequences. We've never been able to do that well for the reason you say, which is it's impossible to look ahead and foresee all the consequences of things. So that kind of regulation or direction, I think, doesn't work well. What we have always done in the past is do what we're doing now, which is we have new things, we're excited about them, we start to realize the downsides, and then we have a conversation about how to structure what the companies are doing, what regulators are doing, what societies are doing to try to steer them in a better direction ex post. And so in some sense, I think it's not a bad idea to say the innovator's job is to innovate, to come up with exciting new ideas. The market is going to decide which of those have value, and then where there are market failures, that mean the things that have value, that seem to have value in the market, are not necessarily great for society. We try to wrestle with that as a society ex post.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, also two things. One is a very small point, but on the other side, what you find with respect to the news, you find that people know less, but they're less polarized. I wonder how much that is a necessary condition, that people know less, they're less angry about things, and how much is actually due to how Facebook works and the algorithm that keep giving people things that are within that line of thought and more extreme, because it's more likely they're going to click on it. So if you removed another less extreme views platform from them, would you still have this dichotomy?
Yeah, good question. So first, this fact is consistent with an overwhelming body of evidence that says polarization and political knowledge / engagement go hand in hand. You can see it even in the cross-section. If you just say how polarized are people's views and how much do they say they care about politics or pay attention to politics, the more people are engaged, the more polarized they are. So these things do go together, and I think there is some sense in which we face the trade-off I described, where if you want people to be more engaged and more informed, that's also going to end up with stronger views. But to your question, very importantly, that doesn't mean all ways of doing that are equal, and that there aren't lots of dials we can turn to try to increase the constructive part of that and mitigate the downsides of that. And I think it's broader than we have time for here, but I think there are reasons having nothing to do with what Facebook has done. I think Facebook gets a lot of flack for decisions they made, but I think there's a much more basic level, again, at which social media is a particularly bad platform for delivering news and information. Just kind of deeply, fundamentally think about the way that works and what we think makes for a constructive way to inform people. I think there are deep reasons that have nothing to do with the specifics, that are just about social networks as a way to filter information, that mean it's likely to work badly. And so for sure, we shouldn't take this to mean, there's nothing we can do. We face this dilemma. We should try to make the platforms better.
And one small point, have you checked if afterwards people are more likely to reactivate Facebook but not download it on their phone? That could be something that, like, I'm still plugged in. If I want to check some news on some friends, I can. Yeah. But I don't.
Yeah, it's a good idea. We haven't checked. I think like the vast majority of people have the app on their phone at the end line. But I haven't looked to see the particular pattern of you have an active account. But
that's exactly what I did. That's why that came to mind. Like, I still have a Facebook account, but I removed it from my phone.
Great. That's a great suggestion. Thanks. Sorry, let's just wait for the mic for 1 second.
So to get at some of the network effects on Facebook, I could imagine that there's a couple reasons that people spend less time or, aren't as keen to get back on once they've been off. One could be that, it's just like going to the gym. Like, it's really hard you want the endorphin rush, and when you're used to it, you're going to, even though it's bad for you, you're going to do it. Another reason is that maybe there's social capital on Facebook, and if I've been off and I haven't invested in that for the last month, then I'm now more invested in the people around me, and there's like a slow process I'm going to transition. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on how to detangle those, and if the reactivation, or if you could do an experiment comparing it to some other thing that you get off of and see how quickly it comes back might help you get at some of that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and something we really emphasize, that those Facebook demand effects can work through a number of different channels that we can't decompose. And so one is certainly that there could be some decay in the value of your sort of Facebook capital for having been off. I would say that the most convincing evidence on that I find is the analysis of all of these qualitative interviews and self-reports, where people are overwhelmingly talking about basically things that they learned from this experience about how Facebook was making them happy or not happy, or how they might use it better, or what they want to do more of and what they want to do less of, and almost no discussion of that kind of decay hypothesis, like, well, now that I'm off it for a month, nobody wants to talk to me anymore. My groups have gone on to do other things. So, but I think strictly speaking, we can't separate that from other stories.
Thank you very much. Big round of applause.